A cold millionaire goes to hospital and sees his ex giving birth triplets, and what he discovers shocked all. Welcome to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James. Thank you for joining me today. Wasn't Elena and Elliot's journey just unforgettable? From heartbreak to healing, from silence to love, they proved that even broken stories can have beautiful endings. Tell me, where are you watching from? And what moment touched your heart the most? If this story made you feel something, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs hope today, because here, we don't just tell stories, we live them. See you in the next one. Stay loved, stay strong, and always stay with Beyond Color Stories. The night sky blanketed the city of New York in a shimmering veil of stars as luxury cars rolled one by one up the crescent driveway of the Rosewood Grand Hall, where the annual fundraising gala for orphaned children was being held. Inside, the chandelier-draped ballroom pulsed with soft violin music, champagne towers, and a crowd of the city's elite dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, mingling and laughing under golden lights. Among them, Elena de Cruz entered quietly, her head held high with elegance, wrapped in a satin emerald gown that perfectly complemented her smooth brown skin, glowing like bronze under the dimmed lights. Her long, stylish black hair fell like a waterfall across her back, and her wide, kind eyes scanned the hall with soft curiosity as she clutched a modest black clutch in her hand. She was not there to impress anyone. She had come as a volunteer, having been invited as a speaker who had once lived in the very orphanage the event supported. Elena had a heart full of kindness and pain, beauty and bravery, and although she was used to standing alone, she never allowed her past to define her. She walked with grace, not arrogance, confidence without pride, and her energy carried a quiet glow that warmed the room far more than the chandeliers ever could. On the other side of the ballroom, Elliot Lancaster stood like a storm in a sea of sunshine, a man made of silence and steel, tall and impeccably dressed in a black-on-black tuxedo with sharp lines that matched his jaw and a presence that was both magnetic and menacing. At just 32, Elliot was the CEO of Lancaster MedTech International, one of the largest medical innovation corporations in the world, known not just for his ruthless business moves, but also for his cold demeanor and unapologetically womanizing habits. He was the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had to, didn't love unless it served a purpose, and didn't stay unless there was profit. Women often chased him, falling for his wealth, his power, his icy charm. But he never stayed long enough to remember their names. He was the mystery every socialite wanted to solve, and the heartbreak every girl wished she could survive. Yet, despite being surrounded by shallow laughter, glittering dresses, and seductive smiles, Elliot felt bored, until his eyes caught something that made time stutter. Across the room, in the quiet curve of the gala's entrance, stood a woman who didn't try to shine, yet outshone everyone. Elena. The moment his eyes fell on her, something foreign stirred in his chest, a disorienting pull that unsettled his guarded mind. She wasn't trying to be seen, and yet she stole every breath around her. He narrowed his eyes as he watched her smile softly at an old gentleman who had dropped his glass, stooping elegantly to help. Her kindness was unfiltered, her aura untouched by the hunger of high society. He couldn't look away. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was the most stunning woman he had ever seen. It was the warmth she exhaled in a room so cold, the truth that radiated from her without effort. For a man who'd built walls like skyscrapers around his emotions, Elliot felt something crack, something shift in a place he hadn't visited in years. Without a word, without a plan, he began walking across the floor toward her, like gravity had chosen her as its anchor. Eleanor noticed him approaching, his stride steady and his gaze sharp like winter fire. She had seen him before, on magazine covers, on business panels, even once at a press conference. but nothing compared to witnessing him in person. Elliot Lancaster had a face carved by destiny, bearded, masculine with high cheekbones, and an intensity in his eyes that could silence a room. His hair was dark and swept back stylishly, and his aura commanded space without a single word. As he neared, Elena felt her chest tighten with the weight of something she couldn't name. He stopped just in front of her, so close she could smell the earthy richness of his cologne, a scent that made her stomach flutter. For a moment, neither of them spoke, just stood there in a silence so loud it drowned out the orchestra playing in the background. Then, with a voice smoother than aged whiskey, he said, "I don't usually chase stars, but you're different. Who are you?" Elena blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "I'm not anyone important," she replied softly, meeting his gaze with calm strength. "Just someone who used to live in the stories this event supports." Her voice had a melody to it, gentle, honest, and full of soul. Elliot tilted his head, intrigued not just by her words, but by the way she spoke them, not to impress, not to flirt, but simply to exist. "You're more important than anyone here," he said, his tone firm. "I've never seen someone glow without even trying." Elena chuckled lightly, her eyes softening. "Flattery doesn't suit a man like you, Mr. Lancaster." He smirked, lips barely curving. "Then let me try honesty. I want to know you. Now tonight. And I don't want to wait." It was the kind of confession that might have made other women swoon, but Elena didn't melt. She stared at him, silent, reading beyond his surface. She saw the coldness in him, the guarded edges, but she also saw something else, a flicker of sincerity trying to break through. She wasn't naive, and yet something inside her whispered, "This night might change everything." She let herself smile, small but true. "Then let's start with a dance." Nothing more. Elliot extended his hand without a word, and she placed hers gently in his. The moment their skin touched, something electric passed between them. The ballroom blurred as he led her to the center, and they began to sway slowly to the melody. His hand on her waist, hers on his chest, their eyes locked in a quiet war of curiosity, attraction, and something deeper neither could define. As the night unfolded, they talked, not like strangers, but like souls who had known each other in another life. He told her about his childhood hospital visits that turned him cold, his ambition born from pain, his mistrust in love. She shared stories of sleeping alone in the orphanage, of learning to dream despite being told not to, of how love was something she gave without expecting it back. They drifted into the gardens under moonlight, her gown rustling against the wind, his coat draped over her shoulders. Then, as silence circled them again, he leaned in and whispered, "You've ruined every woman for me tonight." Elena's heart thudded. "And you've confused every truth I believed about men," she said quietly. When his lips met hers, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, unsure, deep, a kiss that made promises and told apologies all at once. That night, Elena didn't resist the pull she felt. She followed her heart and entered his penthouse wrapped in city lights and velvet shadows. Everything about their night together felt like suspended time, a moment outside logic, where walls melted and fire bloomed. He undressed her with trembling fingers, not like a man conquering, but a man discovering. She touched him like she was reading his story page by page, and when they lay together, bodies tangled, eyes closed, breathing in each other's truth, it wasn't lust, it was something sacred, like two broken souls had found a place where the world paused just for them. They spoke through touches, through the way he held her afterward, forehead resting on hers, as if for once in his life he didn't want to let go. Elena fell asleep in his arms, a small smile playing on her lips, believing for just that moment that something beautiful had begun. But morning came like a storm cloud. When she stirred awake, sunlight warming the silk sheets, Elliot was already out of bed, half-dressed, staring at his phone. His eyes met hers, but the warmth from last night was gone, replaced by cool detachment. "I have a meeting," he said curtly. Elena sat up slowly, confusion etching her face. "Last night," she began, but he cut her off. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm sorry if I led you on." Her chest caved in as his words fell like daggers. She nodded quietly, too proud to beg for clarity, too hurt to pretend she was okay. He left with the sound of the door clicking shut, a sound that would echo in her heart for weeks. And as she sat alone in his bed, the scent of him still on her skin, Elena realized that sometimes the most beautiful nights leave behind the most painful mornings. The room still held the faint scent of his cologne, lingering like a cruel reminder in the quiet aftermath of everything that had just shattered. Elena sat still, sheets loosely gathered around her, the soft morning light pouring through the penthouse windows, bathing her in gold. But there was no warmth in it, only the biting chill of absence as the echo of the door closing behind Elliot still haunted her like a betrayal wrapped in silence. Her fingers instinctively curled into the silk sheets where he had laid just hours ago, where his hands had touched her so tenderly, where his lips had made promises his voice had now abandoned. And as the silence pressed down like a weight against her chest, she slowly gathered herself up from the bed, not because she felt ready to move, but because lying there any longer made her feel like she would drown in a tide of questions he had left behind without a single answer, her bare feet pressing against the cold marble floor, grounding her into a reality that felt too sharp, too sudden, too cruel. And as she quietly dressed herself back into the emerald gown from the night before, now wrinkled and clinging to her body like a memory that refused to let go, she tried to keep her chin lifted, her dignity intact. But inside, her heart was unraveling one stitch at a time. With each passing second, she was alone in that room, where last night it had felt like she finally mattered, like someone finally saw her. Not as a name on a charity program or a former orphan girl, but as a woman, worthy, beautiful, real. And even if she had let herself fall, if only for one night, now she was left to carry the bruises of that fall all on her own. As soon as she stepped outside the penthouse building, the cool air brushed her cheeks and made her eyes sting. But not from the wind. No, they burned from the storm building behind her eyes, emotions she was too proud to let fall on the public pavement. And so she walked with her head high, biting the inside of her cheek to keep the tears in, gripping her clutch tighter like it could somehow hold together the pieces of her breaking heart. And though her heels clicked confidently against the sidewalk, each step felt heavier than the last because she had no answers, no goodbyes, no closure, only the hollow ache of a man who had made her feel seen, only to vanish before sunrise like a mirage in a desert she hadn't even realized she was wandering through. And later that evening, when she sat on the edge of her modest apartment bed, she finally allowed herself the trembling release of a single tear that slid down her cheek, because even though she had told herself she wouldn't cry, even though she reminded herself that she had survived far worse before, something about the way Elliot had looked at her that night, something about the softness in his touch, the fire in his kiss, had made her believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe she had found someone who would stay. That belief became a slow, torturous poison over the next few days, because she reached out, not with desperation, but with the hope that what they shared had meant something more to him too. And when she called his number, it rang and rang and rang, until the voicemail picked up with that cold, unbothered tone. "This is Elliot Lancaster. Leave a message." And she did. Just one at first, her voice steady, casual, something like, "Hi, Elliot. Just wondering if you're okay." But the silence that followed was deafening, and when he didn't reply, She waited a day, then another, and then she sent one text, a simple line. Hope I didn't misunderstand things. But again, no reply, no acknowledgement, no presence, as if the man who had held her so close had vanished into a parallel world where she had never existed, and the days turned into a blur of unspoken pain, where her eyes scanned headlines she never used to care for, only to find his name again and again, captured on the arms of different women. Blonde socialites, red carpet models, foreign heiresses, all laughing at his side, all linked to the man who had once touched her like she was sacred, and every picture cut her deeper than the last. Not because she wanted to own him, but because it felt like what they had shared meant absolutely nothing to him, like she was just one in a line of forgettable nights, a passing indulgence in a catalogue of wealthy whims. Rumors swirled like cruel gusts through her mind, whispers from online articles and charity blogs that Elliot was spotted vacationing in Paris with a cosmetics queen, then photographed 3 nights later at an exclusive launch party with a champagne heiress on his arm. And though Elena tried to ignore it, to remind herself that she didn't belong in his world, that she had known from the start how cold and distant he was, none of that protected her from the ache of knowing she had given him a piece of herself she never gave to anyone else, not just her body, but her trust, her vulnerability, her heart. And now she was left to pick up the shards without even the dignity of a goodbye. And every time her phone buzzed, her heart fluttered stupidly, hoping maybe, just maybe, it was him realizing what he had left behind, but it never was. And each disappointment built a wall brick by brick inside her, not made of bitterness but of self-preservation, of the need to stand again, even if she felt like sinking. Her days became a quiet war between pretending she was fine and fighting the memories that haunted her in silence, because everything reminded her of him, from the scent of his cologne that clung to her jacket, to the music they had danced to that night, to the softness of his voice in that rooftop garden where he had whispered things that now felt like lies. And though she deleted the messages she once drafted to him and silenced the hope that he might one day knock on her door, the pain didn't fade. It only settled, like dust in the corners of her soul, and instead of mourning him like a loss, she started to treat him like a lesson, one that would teach her never to fall again for beautiful words without beautiful actions, and never to believe in warmth from a man whose soul lived in ice. She buried herself in work, in volunteer events, in helping the children who still looked up to her like she was some kind of beacon, and every time she painted on a smile for them, every time she knelt beside a child to read them a book or hold their tiny hand, she reminded herself that love didn't always come from men. It came from the lives she touched, the healing she gave, and the dignity she refused to let anyone take from her. Still, late at night, when the city lights flickered outside her window and the noise of the world dimmed into the hush of 2 a.m., she would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how he could walk away so easily, wondering if he ever thought about her, even for a second, wondering if she had imagined the fire between them, or if he had simply become so good at faking affection that he could set hearts on fire just to watch them burn. And every time her eyes welled up, she'd take a deep breath, clench her fists, and whisper to herself that she would not shed another tear for a man who treated her like a phase when she had loved him, like a future. No, she would not be the girl who broke over a man who couldn't stay. She would not be defined by a one-night memory, and even if her heart still ached when she heard his name, she would carry herself like a woman who had never been touched by him, never been held, never been left. And as another week passed, then another, Elena's smile became more believable again, her footsteps lighter, her laughter returning slowly like spring after a long, brutal winter, and though the wound hadn't healed, she was learning to live with the scar, to walk with her chin up again, to look in the mirror and see not the girl he had abandoned, but the woman who had survived him. Elliot Lancaster may have vanished, may have treated her as forgettable, but Elena de Cruz would not crumble. She would rise, and no man, no matter how powerful or cold, would ever take away the love she carried within herself again. Elena de Cruz stood in front of her small bedroom mirror on a Sunday morning, sunlight pooling across the wooden floor like spilled honey, and for a long moment she simply stared at herself, her brown, smooth skin still glowing despite the emotional weight she'd been carrying, her long, stylish hair tied back loosely with a silk scarf, eyes slightly duller than they used to be, yet still framed with dignity that refused to die. But beneath that gaze, behind that quiet strength in her reflection, was something else, a quiet discomfort, a gnawing feeling in her body she could no longer ignore, a strange fatigue that wasn't just emotional anymore. It had slowly crept into her limbs, her appetite had gone rogue, and her mornings had turned sour with an unsettling nausea that made her pause with a spoonful of oats halfway to her mouth, then set it down with a tight throat, unsure of what her body was trying to tell her, but unable to silence the growing suspicion in the pit of her soul. And when she sat on the edge of her bed that day, pressing her palm gently over her lower abdomen without fully understanding why, a part of her already knew the answer before any doctor could confirm it. But knowing wasn't the same as accepting, and she needed clarity, not assumptions. So she pulled on her coat, tied her scarf neatly around her neck, and took a cab to the nearest women's clinic with shaking hands and a stomach that refused to settle. The waiting room was painted in soft lavender tones and filled with the gentle scent of chamomile, but none of it could calm her nerves as she sat in the chair tapping her fingers against the armrest while a mother with a toddler giggled softly beside her, and a nurse in pale blue scrubs called out patient names one by one. And when finally, "Ms. Elena de Cruz," echoed into the air, she stood slowly, like every step toward the unknown took courage from a well that was already running dry, and she followed the nurse down a long hallway to a quiet room where the doctor greeted her warmly, listened patiently as Elena explained her symptoms in a low, guarded voice: fatigue, nausea, late cycle, odd cravings, emotional waves that crash too hard for just heartbreak. And when the test was taken, when the doctor stepped out to wait for the results, Elena sat there with her fingers clenched in her lap, eyes staring at the medical poster on the wall, but not really seeing it, heart drumming in her ears like a war cry from somewhere deep within her chest. And when the door finally creaked open again, and the doctor's eyes met hers gently, kindly, with that unmistakable softness that came only when life was about to change, Elena already knew what was about to be spoken, but hearing it still felt like being hit by a tidal wave made of silence and truth. "Elena," the doctor said, voice tender, professional, and filled with a quiet awe, "you're pregnant, about 5 weeks along." The words didn't crash into her so much as they settled over her like snowfall, quiet but heavy, and for a long moment Elena just stared at her hands, trying to make sense of how something so small could carry so much meaning, how a single night could bloom into a forever shift. And when she finally lifted her eyes again, she didn't cry, she didn't tremble, she didn't break. Instead, she nodded once, slowly, as if absorbing the truth like water into cracked earth, and whispered so softly the doctor had to lean in to hear her, "Okay." No panic, no outrage, just the deep, thunderous silence of a woman accepting her fate with quiet power. The cab ride home was a blur. Cars and people rushed past her window, but she barely registered them, her thoughts inward and tangled, her palm resting gently over her stomach now like it was the most sacred place in the world, her mind spinning not with fear, but with questions. What would this mean for her life? Could she really do this alone? Was she ready to raise a child born from a night of fleeting tenderness and long-standing abandonment? And more painfully, should she tell him? Did Elliot deserve to know that his child was growing inside her? And the answer came sharp and fast, like the crack of glass in winter. No, he didn't. He didn't deserve it. Not after walking away like she was nothing, not after disappearing without a trace or word or explanation, not after treating their night like a passing fantasy while she was left to carry its echo in her womb, alone. He had made it clear with his silence, with his distance, with his coldness. He didn't want her, didn't value her, and she would not burden herself or her baby with the hope that he might become someone different, just because fate had left a part of him inside her. Back in her apartment, Elena stood still in the center of the living room, arms crossed protectively over her chest as her eyes fell on the bookshelf where the framed photo of her parents still sat. Gone too soon, the only family she ever truly had. And she closed her eyes, feeling their spirits surround her in that moment, imagining her mother's voice telling her she could do this. That strength wasn't just about standing tall when life was easy, but standing even when everything inside you trembled, and she whispered to the air, to the soul of the child within her, "I've got you, little one. I may be alone, but you won't be unloved." And just like that, something inside her clicked. Not just acceptance, but resolve. Not just pain, but purpose. And from that moment on, Elena de Cruz stopped seeing herself as a woman left behind and started seeing herself as a mother stepping forward. She didn't tell anyone, not her friends, not her co-workers, not even the lady next door who always offered tea and asked too many questions, because this part of her life felt sacred, felt too raw and too real to be shared with people who might misunderstand it, who might pity her, and Elena didn't want pity. She wanted power, control, dignity, and as her belly slowly, imperceptibly began to change, she adjusted her wardrobe, began eating more carefully, reading books at night under soft lamplight about prenatal care, listening to classical music she'd never cared for before, but now found calming for reasons she didn't quite understand. And every time she touched her stomach, she imagined tiny fingers and soft coos, and eyes that might look like hers or his, and the ache in her chest would swell, not with sorrow any more, but with fierce, wild love. The nights were hardest, though, when the silence stretched too long and her bed felt too cold, and the weight of doing it all alone crept up from the edges of her thoughts, like fog seeping under a door. But even then she held herself close, whispered affirmations to her unborn child, promises of a life where they would never feel unwanted, where they would know love even if it came in a form that looked nothing like fairy tales or magazine covers. And as the weeks passed and her body shifted, so did her soul. Elena de Cruz became a woman reborn, her softness still intact, but now lined with iron will and maternal fire, and though her heart had been bruised, her spirit was nowhere near broken. It was only just beginning to bloom again. She attended doctor visits with a smile, alone but undeterred, answered each nurse's cheerful question with calm strength, listened intently to the heartbeat fluttering inside her during ultrasounds, and let tears roll silently down her cheek, not from sadness but awe, because inside her now lived something greater than betrayal, something more powerful than heartbreak. A future, a new chapter, a love story that didn't begin with a man's affection, but with her own courage. The morning light filtered through Elena's window like a gentle blessing from the skies above, kissing the walls of her modest apartment with a soft golden hue as she stirred quietly beneath the warmth of her blanket, her hand instinctively resting over the small swell of her belly, where life had begun to gently announce itself. It had been several weeks since the first ultrasound confirmed her pregnancy, and though the path ahead remained uncertain, her steps had grown steadier, her mornings less heavy, and her soul began to form a rhythm, slow, strong, and rooted in the quiet promise she whispered to herself each night, "I will do this, no matter what." Today was one of those important days again, a follow-up checkup to ensure everything was progressing smoothly, a routine ultrasound, or so she thought, one she approached with calm anticipation. She didn't expect anything unusual, didn't prepare for any surprises, didn't know her heart was about to expand far beyond what she thought it could carry. She slipped into a soft beige maternity dress that clung comfortably to her curves and tied her long, stylish hair back into a low bun with a velvet scrunchie, leaving a few waves cascading beside her cheeks. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired but brave, the kind of beauty that didn't fade but evolved under pressure, glowing from the strength that came with holding a life inside. With a final soft exhale, she grabbed her purse and stepped into the day, walking toward the clinic with her heart humming beneath her ribs. The air was slightly crisp, the clouds painted across the sky like gentle brushstrokes, and as she walked past a florist shop, the scent of fresh roses drifted to her assistant, reminding her that even in difficult seasons, beauty could bloom. At the women's clinic, the receptionist greeted her by name now, familiarity forming between them like threads weaving into a quilt, and Elena returned the smile before settling into her usual seat by the tall ficus tree in the corner of the waiting room. She placed her hand lightly on her belly again as she waited, whispering softly under her breath to the life growing inside, "Mommy's here, baby. We're doing good, right?" A soft flutter in her stomach responded, or perhaps it was imagination, but it brought a smile to her lips anyway. Then her name was called, and she rose with a gentle poise, following the nurse down the hallway to the ultrasound room that now felt like a familiar space rather than a sterile chamber of uncertainty. Dr. Mirza, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes, softened by kindness, greeted Elena with a warm smile and a gentle tone. "How are we feeling today, Ms. de Cruz?" she asked, and Elena nodded with that quiet strength she was becoming known for. "Tired," she replied with a chuckle, "but hopeful." The doctor gestured toward the reclined exam bed with its crisp sheet and screen mounted on the wall, and as Elena settled in and lifted her dress just enough for the scan, she tried to steady her breathing. She'd done this before, but for some reason her heart thudded differently today. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fate drawing near with a revelation. The gel was cold on her skin, and Elena flinched slightly as the transducer moved across her belly. The room grew silent except for the soft hum of the machine. Then a sound broke through, the unmistakable rhythmic pulsing of a heartbeat. Elena smiled, but then came another, and another. Dr. Mirza's brows lifted, and a look of surprised delight crossed her face as she stared at the screen. She didn't speak at first, her eyes scanning and rescanning, her fingers tapping to adjust the image as Elena watched her, curious but calm. "Everything okay?" Elena asked, voice light with concern. Dr. Mirza finally looked up with a grin that reached all the way to her kind eyes, her voice lifting slightly with warmth as she said, "Elena, I want you to take a deep breath for me." The world seemed to pause. Elena blinked. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling only slightly. The doctor turned the screen toward her fully now and said the words that would change the course of her life once more. "Because you're not carrying one baby, or even two. You're expecting triplets, 2 boys and 1 girl." For a second, time folded in on itself. The words hit her chest with the softness of feathers but the weight of mountains. Her eyes widened as her lips parted without sound, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze darted to the screen where tiny forms flickered in soft monochrome. A delicate dance of 3 little lives nestled inside her. She didn't move, couldn't. Her fingers clutched at the blanket over her legs, and then it happened. Tears burst forward without warning, but they weren't the tears of sorrow or shock. They were tears born from awe, from terror laced with love, from the sheer incomprehensible wonder of carrying not 1, but 3 lives inside her body. She covered her mouth as a sob escaped, and Dr. Mirza gently placed a hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. "I know it's a lot to process," the doctor said gently, "but all 3 are healthy. They're growing beautifully. We'll need to monitor you more closely moving forward, but this is a miracle, Elena." Elena nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks now unchecked, her heart rising like a tide beneath the moon's pull. "Three," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "Three hearts, three souls, my babies." She looked back at the screen, her hand pressing protectively over her belly again, this time with a new sense of urgency, of protection, of an unspoken vow forming inside her like a sacred prayer. As she dressed again, still in a daze, Dr. Mirza handed her a few ultrasound prints, and Elena stared at them like they were ancient scrolls holding secrets from the universe. She clutched them to her chest as she left the room, moving slowly through the hallway, past the waiting area, and out into the sun-drenched world that now felt forever altered. She didn't rush home. She walked through a nearby park instead, her shoes crunching softly against the gravel as children laughed in the distance and birds chirped from branches overhead. She sat on a bench beneath a jacaranda tree in full bloom, purple petals fluttering around her like blessings, and stared at the photos in her hands again, letting the reality settle. 3 babies, 2 sons, 1 daughter. Her mind raced with what this would mean, financially, physically, emotionally. She had no partner, no family, no wealthy support system, no promises of shared burdens. But she had herself. She had her love. And she had them, her children, her miracles, her second chance at a kind of love that wouldn't abandon her. She leaned back against the bench and placed both hands on her belly with reverence, her eyes lifting to the sky, and with a voice that trembled with strength, she said, "I don't know how I'll do this, but I will. I promise. I'll love you with everything I have, even if I have to do it all on my own." The breeze kissed her face as if the universe was listening. The months that followed Elena's quiet promise beneath the jacaranda tree were long and often lonely, but they were not empty, for her days began to fill with the rhythms of preparing for 3 lives, and her world slowly transformed into a place where love was no longer something she waited to receive from others, but something she planted in every corner of her life like seeds of purpose, blooming with silent resolve. Her tiny apartment changed. One corner now held 3 bassinets. Another was stacked with diapers and second-hand baby clothes she had collected after long days of working as a part-time school administrator, then returning home to complete freelance writing projects just to make ends meet. The exhaustion was constant, but so was the quiet joy. The pregnancy grew difficult as her belly expanded far more quickly than most. By the 7th month, her steps had slowed, her back cried out by the end of each day, and sleep became a luxury she could hardly remember. But her determination never wavered. There were nights she cried alone, not because of fear, but because of the sheer intensity of carrying 3 growing hearts inside her body without a partner beside her, without someone to rub her back or whisper words of encouragement when the weight of it all threatened to break her spine and her spirit. Yet every morning she woke again with a strength born of love and survival, repeating to herself in the mirror, "You are enough. You will do this. They are counting on you." And so the days turned, and the seasons passed, until one morning in late spring, the skies outside her window burst with thunder and sheets of rain, as if nature itself sensed the change that was about to unfold. Elena had woken earlier than usual, drenched in sweat, her chest heaving with the unmistakable tightness that gripped her lower belly in waves of sharp pain she had never known before. It started slowly, as if her body was testing its limits, but soon the pressure became unbearable, the contractions sharper, and her breath caught with each one. Her hands trembled as she reached for her overnight bag, one she had packed weeks earlier with baby clothes, ID cards, and hope, and placed it by the door. With a trembling voice, she called for a ride to the hospital, biting back the cry that rose in her throat. She knew this was it. The day had come. Her babies were ready. Her body was ready. And she was not alone, even if no one walked beside her. The hospital room was already waiting, its sterile air humming with preparation as nurses bustled about. Elena was wheeled into the maternity wing with urgency, her eyes squeezed shut against the contractions that now came every few minutes. Her hands gripped the side rails of the bed, sweat glistening on her forehead, her long hair sticking to her face in waves that refused to stay pinned back. The pain was searing, shooting through her spine with every deep breath, but she clenched her jaw and pushed it down. Her eyes focused on the ceiling lights whizzing past, blinking in and out of view, as her mind repeated only one mantra: for them, for them, for them. Across the hospital, in a wing reserved for VIP guests and partners, a tall man in a charcoal suit entered. Through the marble-lined entrance flanked by executives and assistants, Elliot Lancaster, the cold billionaire CEO with a gaze like winter and a jawline like carved steel, walked with practiced confidence through the corridors of the city's most prestigious medical research center. He was there for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of a new department funded by his innovation group, one that focused on neonatal AI monitoring systems. Cameras followed him, doctors greeted him with reverent smiles, and his assistants whispered about press releases and shareholders. He was, as always, in full control, his expression unreadable, his voice clipped and polite. But as the ceremony ended and his schedule allowed for a private tour of the facility, Elliot politely dismissed the group and walked the halls alone for a moment of quiet introspection. His steps were slow, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks, and his mind momentarily wandered, not toward business strategies or board meetings, but to something more abstract. A face, a memory, a woman he hadn't allowed himself to think of for months. Elena. Her name passed through his mind like a whisper from another life, a ghost that haunted the space just beyond his reach. He'd buried the memory, tucked it under cold decisions and distractions with other women, none of whom could wash the scent of her from his memory. Her skin, her kindness, that one night, and the way she had disappeared as if she'd never existed, as if she had simply dissolved into the air after being claimed like a beautiful, fleeting dream. He told himself she'd moved on, that it meant nothing. And yet, sometimes, at night, he remembered the way her hand had curled around his chest, the way her breath had hitched when he whispered to her, the way she had looked at him like he was worth loving, and he hated that he had walked away. As he moved past the maternity ward, a sudden scream of pain pierced the corridor like a blade. It was a woman's voice, a voice familiar not just in sound but in soul. His steps faltered. He stopped. Something in his chest dropped. He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing, and there, through the open double doors of a delivery room, he saw her, Elena. She lay on the hospital bed, her body writhing in agony, nurses surrounding her with urgency. Her dress had been replaced with a pale blue hospital gown, her face drenched in sweat, her long curls falling around her like a storm as she clutched her belly, now swollen beyond belief. His breath left his body in a hard, stunned silence. His hands went numb. It was her, and she was heavily pregnant. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. His heart slammed against his ribs as he approached the nurse's station, the cold mask of his businessman persona cracking with every second. "I need to know about the woman in room 4B, he said to the receptionist, his voice low but trembling with a panic that surprised even him. "Elena de Cruz. Is she in labor?" The nurse looked up, startled by his urgency, then blinked at the name. She typed quickly and gave him a careful glance. "Yes, Ms. de Cruz was admitted an hour ago. She's expecting triplets, 2 boys and a girl, very high-risk labor." The doctor is already with her. The words hit Elliot like a fist to the gut. Triplets. His legs buckled slightly, but he caught himself on the edge of the counter. His eyes blinked fast, trying to make sense of the storm swirling inside his chest. The timelines, the memories, the math. It all aligned. That one night, that single night of passion and fire. And now, 3 lives, 3 children, his children. It couldn't be coincidence. He stumbled backward, breath hitching, and looked back toward the door, where Elena's cries echoed down the hallway again. Every sound twisted the knife in his chest deeper. He didn't enter the room. Not yet. He stayed in the hallway, leaning against the wall like a man unraveling. Shame and disbelief warred within him. How could he have left her? How had he not known? And how could she bear all this pain alone while he attended ceremonies and collected accolades? His chest cracked open with something raw and unfamiliar. Regret. Real, searing, unbearable regret. As doctors and nurses moved in and out of the delivery room, he stood there, silent, waiting, not as a CEO or a man used to getting answers, but as someone who suddenly realized he had missed the most important moments of his life. And as another scream rose from behind that door, this time laced with a sob that shattered his composure, Elliot dropped his face into his hands and let out a breath that trembled with something close to grief. His ghost hadn't returned. He was the ghost. And now, for the first time, he wanted nothing more than to be seen. The air in the hospital corridor had never felt heavier than it did as Elliot Lancaster stood frozen near the maternity wing's reception desk. The sterile scent of antiseptics hung in the atmosphere, but all he could smell was the ghost of her skin, the warmth of Elena's body against his that one night, the softness of her laughter, the scent of her hair that had embedded itself into his soul like a haunting. The weight of what the receptionist had just told him rang through his mind like cathedral bells. She's delivering triplets today. Not 1, not 2, 3. A trio of new lives, potentially created from that night that had both electrified and terrified him. The night he had told himself to forget because it had made him feel too much, too fast. Now reality came crashing down like a tidal wave against everything he thought he had secured in his carefully guarded world. Triplets. The word didn't make sense at first. It felt like fiction. But each syllable clawed deeper into his chest. With every breath he took, unraveling the lies he had fed himself, that their night had been a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything, that walking away had been the right decision. How could it be meaningless when 3 new lives were breathing into existence right now, in this very building, while he stood helpless and horrified outside the door? Elliot's hands trembled at his sides, his fingers curling into fists as a dozen emotions warred within him. He was known for being stoic in boardrooms, unshakable in crisis, untouchable in chaos. But now, in the clean halls of the hospital he had partly funded through his medical tech empire, he felt like a man who didn't deserve the empire he'd built. Not when he had turned his back on the one woman who had carried his future inside her, alone. He moved away from the reception slowly, not knowing where to go, but not wanting to leave. He found a seat in the quiet waiting corner near the delivery rooms, its beige cushions stiff beneath him, and sat down like a man falling from a great height. The seconds ticked by in deafening silence, though in his mind there was nothing but noise. He tried to remember if she had tried to reach out after that night. Had there been a call, a message, a sign? Or had he simply been too cold, too quick to block it out, too proud to see past his fear of connection? Shame tightened around his throat like a collar as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head buried in his hands. His entire life, his wealth, his companies, his power, none of it meant anything in this moment. All he could think of was her face as she cried out in pain, her voice, her body trembling, her eyes wild with agony. And he had not been by her side. His watch ticked painfully slow. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 20. Nurses rushed past him in a blur. Occasionally, the door to the delivery wing would open, and he would hear the sound of muffled moans and commands from doctors. Every time he heard Elena's cries, his stomach twisted, his throat tightened, and his heart beat faster with helpless panic. He couldn't go in. He didn't know if he was allowed, didn't know if she would want him there. But leaving was not an option either. He was anchored to this place now. Something inside him had changed the moment he saw her on that hospital bed, her belly round and full of life, her body shaking through the agony of labor. Her lips parted in breathless groans. He wasn't just a stranger watching a woman suffer anymore. He was a man coming face to face with a reality he had turned away from for too long. And for the first time in years, Elliot Lancaster, the ice-veined billionaire who never cracked, felt himself shattering. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. He didn't check his phone. He didn't respond to the missed calls from his assistant or the flurry of emails piling up from investors. Nothing else mattered. Nothing could. His leg bounced uncontrollably as he sat forward in the chair, eyes fixed on the double doors, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. What if something went wrong? What if she wasn't okay? What if he never got the chance to speak to her, to explain, to ask, no, beg, for a chance to do something right? 1,000 terrible possibilities danced through his mind, tormenting him. He deserved to be tormented. She had done everything on her own. For 9 months. And he hadn't even known. Then it happened. The hallway lights flickered slightly. The delivery room doors burst open as a nurse hurried out, heading toward the neonatal unit. And then, in the quiet that followed, a sound sliced through the corridor like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A baby's cry, then another, and then, unbelievably, a third. Elliot stood up, his legs weak beneath him, his heart pounding with a ferocity that left him breathless. He took a step toward the doors, instinct propelling him, needing to see, to know. He didn't dare push them open, so he waited just beside the glass window as another nurse walked past with a wrapped bundle in her arms. A baby, pink and wailing and impossibly small. He didn't know if it was one of his. He didn't know anything. But something deep in his gut, something primal and unshakable, whispered, "Yes, they are yours." Moments later, another nurse passed by, this time holding 2 babies. His knees nearly buckled. He couldn't breathe. The sight of those infants, tiny and perfect, was too much. His throat tightened with emotion, his vision blurred. He wiped at his eyes quickly, unaware of the tears streaming down his face. Then, finally, he saw her. The door to the delivery room eased open slightly as a nurse exited. Through the narrow gap, Elliot caught a glimpse of the woman who had never left his thoughts, not for a day, not for a moment. Elena de Cruz lay propped up in bed, her face pale and damp with sweat, her body exhausted but glowing with the surreal light that only mothers possess. In her arms were 3 tiny swaddled forms, 2 boys and 1 girl. Her head tilted down, her lips gently brushing the forehead of the baby girl. Her eyes fluttered closed, overwhelmed by the moment, tears glistening on her lashes. Elliot's heart cracked open so wide he wasn't sure if it could ever be stitched shut again. He watched her without speaking, without breathing, his entire existence narrowing to this single moment. The room was silent to him, the world outside ceasing to exist. All that remained was her, this woman he had wronged, this goddess of strength and beauty, now a mother to 3 small pieces of him. How had he walked away from something so real, so precious? How had he convinced himself it had meant nothing when it had meant everything? He didn't try to enter. Not yet. He didn't know if he had the right. He stood there, hands in fists, pain swelling in his chest as he watched Elena whisper something to the babies. Maybe their names. Maybe a promise. Maybe a lullaby. He would never know, but he wanted to. He wanted to know everything now. He wanted to be part of this life, her life, their lives, not as a stranger, not as a ghost, but as a man who finally understood what love really looked like. And for the first time, he didn't want control. He didn't want power. He didn't want pleasure. He wanted redemption. He stepped back slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat, and turned away from the glass. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the polished hallway window. A man who had everything and yet, in this moment, felt like he had nothing until he could earn her forgiveness. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. But this time it wasn't to issue orders or check his schedule. It was to call his assistant and tell them to cancel everything. Every meeting, every flight, every engagement. He wasn't leaving this hospital, not until he knew those babies were safe, not until he could look Elena in the eye and tell her he was sorry, and not until he could whisper to all three of those tiny new souls, "I'm your father, and I will never leave you again." Elliot stood just outside the room, the corridor's quiet hum doing nothing to muffle the thunderstorm raging inside his chest. He had never felt so paralyzed, not even during the riskiest business mergers or public investor showdowns, because nothing, not billions, not power, had ever held this kind of weight. But now it was her, Elena, and those three tiny lives swaddled in soft cloths that turned the stone man inside him into something unrecognizable. His knuckles were white where his fingers clenched the polished doorknob. His heart pounded a rhythm too loud for the sterile silence around him. With trembling resolve, he finally turned the handle and stepped inside. The beeping of hospital monitors, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, and the soft rustling of baby blankets formed a fragile soundscape that greeted him. She was sitting up in the bed now, her back supported by pillows, her arms gently cradling her daughter, while the twin boys lay beside her in the hospital crib. Her hair, tousled from labor, framed her glowing yet exhausted face, and her brown skin radiated a quiet strength that made Elliot's chest ache. She didn't look at him when he entered. She knew. She felt him. She stiffened slightly, but never met his eyes. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes, those beautiful, expressive eyes, were misted with pain, but not the kind she'd cried out with hours ago in labor. This was deeper, older, emotional, and it was all his doing. Elliot stood motionless for a moment, unsure whether he should speak or kneel or simply beg. "Elena," he started, but his voice cracked. She didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tiny baby, girl sleeping in her arms. He stepped closer, each step feeling like wading through quicksand. I saw you. I didn't know. I swear if I had—" She cut him off with a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through steel. "Would it have mattered?" she asked without looking up. That sentence gutted him, not because it was cruel, but because it was deserved. She turned her head then, slowly, her eyes locking on his for the first time in 9 months, and the hurt behind them knocked the breath from his lungs. "Would it have made a difference, Elliot? Would you have stayed, or would you have just left sooner?" Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. She held the baby tighter, protectively, instinctively. Elliot opened his mouth, searching for words, apologies, anything that could wrap around the scope of his failure. But nothing came out, because nothing felt enough. "Are they?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Are they mine?" That question hung in the air like a curse. Elena's face twisted, not in confusion, not even in anger, but something worse, disappointment. "Does it matter to you now?" she asked, her voice brittle. "After all these months, does it finally matter who they belong to? because it didn't matter when I cried alone, or when I vomited through the first trimester, or when I worked double shifts just to save for their arrival. It didn't matter when I lay awake at night, holding my belly, whispering to them that I'd never let them feel abandoned. It didn't matter then. Elliot staggered back slightly as if her words physically hit him. She wasn't yelling. Her tone was calm, but that calmness carried the weight of heartbreak, betrayal, and the strength of a woman who had already picked up her own broken pieces and refused to let him shatter her again. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, the words almost shameful coming from a man used to having every answer. She shook her head, not in pity but finality. "You don't need to say anything. You've said enough by not being there." He wanted to fall to his knees right there, but she turned away from him, facing the babies now. That silent gesture said it all. She didn't want him there. And yet, his feet were rooted to the ground, his heart torn open. He walked backward, slowly, his chest heaving, then exited the room without another word. Outside, his world blurred. He walked to his car like a man drunk with regret and sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, fists clenched on his thighs. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. But one thing burned into his mind. He had to know. He needed truth, not to doubt her, but because something inside him needed a confirmation that would shake him awake from the toxic mindset that had once allowed him to walk away from love. That evening, without telling her, he placed a confidential call. Through private hospital connections, he secured the DNA comparison using the lab where his foundation funded genetic studies. It was discreet, quick, clinical, but not cold, because behind that order was a man who had already begun unraveling at the seams. 2 days later, the results arrived at his penthouse. A white envelope, a single sheet of paper, 3 percentages, each one, 99.9%. Triplets. His. Elliot collapsed onto the floor, the paper fluttering from his grip, his vision blurring with emotion. They were his children, and she, Elena, had done it all without him. His breath hitched as he dragged his palm over his face, stunned by the truth that now carved itself into his bones. These weren't just statistics. These were names waiting to be whispered, foreheads waiting to be kissed, lives waiting to be embraced. That night, Elliot didn't sleep. He walked through the nursery he had built years ago with no plan to use. He touched the unused crib, stared at the mobile that once felt decorative and now felt symbolic. For the first time in his life, he didn't want escape. He didn't want indulgence. He didn't want distance. He wanted to be a father. He wanted to undo every second he had missed. And he wanted to be near the only woman who had ever made him feel worthy of something greater than power. The next morning, with dark circles under his eyes and resolve in his spine, Elliot stood outside her hospital room once again, this time not as a cold man with doubts, but as a man softened by truth, begging for a second chance to become someone she and those 3 babies could trust. Elliot didn't wait for permission anymore. He no longer relied on convenient excuses, on board meetings, or jet-set lifestyles to shield him from the emotional fallout of his mistakes. The man who once wore power like armor now stood in front of a modest apartment building, holding 3 large paper bags packed with baby essentials, his heart pounding harder than it had during any corporate takeover. It was late afternoon when he rang the bell for apartment 2B, AND for a full 2 minutes. No one answered. He rang again. Still silence. But he wasn't leaving. He sat outside her door for hours that day, and though Elena never came out, he gently placed the bags by her doorstep and walked away, whispering a soft, "I'm sorry," into the hallway air. The next morning she found them. Diapers in every size, premium formula, tiny onesies. A handwritten note that simply said, "I don't deserve a place in your world, but I want to earn one in theirs." Elena stared at it for a long time. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her jaw was tight. She wasn't ready to trust the man who had once vanished like vapor after burning her heart alive, and Elliot knew that. Yet he returned the next day, and the next. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes toys. Other days he just stood outside with nothing but guilt and longing, hoping she'd open the door. For a week, she didn't. But then, one morning, she cracked the door open just an inch. Her tired eyes peeked through. "What do you want?" she asked flatly. "To help," he said quietly, like a man humbled. "Too late," she replied and closed it again. But she hadn't slammed it. That meant something to him. So he came again. When he found out from the building manager that she was juggling a part-time job at a coffee shop, working late shifts while still waking up throughout the night for the babies, his heart broke anew. He waited outside the coffee shop once, saw her inside behind the counter, eyes heavy with fatigue, hair tucked beneath a scarf, trying to smile at customers while stealing glances at her phone for updates from the babysitter. Elliot stayed hidden but watched the way she fought through exhaustion like a warrior. It made his guilt sharper, his desire to help stronger. That night, while she was at work, he quietly paid her rent for the next 6 months and slipped the receipt into her mailbox with another note. "You shouldn't have to do this alone." No signature, no ego, just sincerity. Days passed. Elena said nothing, but he noticed the small signs. The bags he left were taken inside now. The groceries weren't left to spoil anymore. Then came the rainy evening that changed everything. It had been pouring for hours. Elliot had driven across town to drop off more supplies, ignoring the soaked roads and thunder. He hadn't planned to knock, but something told him he needed to see her. Just once. Just to know she was okay. When he reached the building, he saw her light was still on. He walked up, his footsteps quiet on the stairwell, and before he could raise his hand to knock, he found the door slightly ajar. Panic surged through him. He pushed it gently open and stepped inside, heart racing, and what he saw froze him. Elena was asleep on the couch, her head tilted back, her long, damp curls cascading over her shoulder. Her brown skin glistened faintly in the soft glow of a table lamp. Her arms were cradling the smallest of the triplets, and beside her the two boys were nestled in the crook of her legs, their tiny chests rising and falling in innocent peace. She hadn't even had time to swaddle them properly. She'd fallen asleep mid-soothing. Bottles lay scattered. A burp cloth had fallen to the floor. She was still wearing her work uniform, creased and damp from the rain, and the sight of her so utterly drained, yet still holding on to those babies like a shield, shattered something inside Elliot. He closed the door softly behind him, not wanting to wake them, but he couldn't stop the tears that formed in his eyes. His breath caught in his throat, and before he realized it, he was on his knees in front of her, hands shaking. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out to fix the baby girl's blanket, his fingers brushing against the infant's soft curls. Then his eyes met Elena's tired face again. The weight of every absence, every silence, every moment she had cried alone came crashing down on him like a tidal wave of shame. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep, not just for what he had done, but for what she had endured. His voice was a whisper soaked in regret. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I should have been here. I should have protected you. I should have held you that night and every night after. I was a coward, a fool. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it anyway. Please, please let me make this right." He didn't expect her to respond, but her eyes fluttered open slowly, exhaustion evident, and for a moment she stared at him without expression. Then her voice came, so quiet it could have been mistaken for a sigh. "You weren't there when I needed you the most, Elliot." Just that, a simple, piercing truth. It landed heavier than any accusation. He nodded, still on his knees, tears running freely now. "I know. and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, not as a businessman, not for redemption, just as a man who finally sees the woman he never deserved and the children who carry my blood." She didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked at him. And though her heart was still heavy and the wounds hadn't healed, she didn't tell him to leave. Not that night. That night, Elliot stayed. He held the babies as she finally showered. He made her tea. He folded laundry that was long overdue. And when the babies cried at 2 a.m., he was the one who rocked them to sleep. Not with perfection, but with sincerity. Because the cold man who once vanished into the shadows had returned, not with excuses, but with quiet persistence, building a bridge back to the heart he once broke. The sun crept over the edge of the world the next morning, casting a golden hue across the tiny apartment where time had silently shifted overnight, not with loud declarations, but with quiet steps and deeper breaths. Elena awoke with a blanket over her shoulders, one she hadn't remembered pulling up. Her eyes blinked slowly, disoriented, and then she noticed the faint sound of humming from the kitchen. Elliot stood barefoot by the stove, holding one of the triplets, Julian, in one arm, while the other gently stirred a pot on the stove. He was humming some off-key lullaby, his beard slightly unkempt, his sleeves rolled up, and dark circles forming under his eyes, yet his expression was peaceful, focused, and soft. The man who once lived in polished penthouses now looked like he belonged here, in the chaos, in the crumbs on the floor, in the love that lingered like morning dew. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched him. And he, somehow sensing her gaze, turned and smiled with a kind of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "He wouldn't sleep unless he was held," Elliot said gently, nodding toward. The baby snuggled against his chest. "So I held him." Elena's lips parted slightly. Her heart ached in that place where once only pain had lived. Now something else tried to bloom, a hesitant hope. As the hours passed, the morning turned into a slow unraveling of truths. With the babies asleep again, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, not touching, not rushing, just breathing in the space they hadn't shared for so long. Elliot was the first to speak. "You don't owe me your time," he began, "but I owe you the truth." He told her everything, how that night had cracked open something inside him, how terrified he'd felt afterward, how he'd buried himself in his work, trying to suppress what he couldn't control, how he hated himself when he saw her in pain and realized what he'd left behind. "I wasn't raised to understand love," he admitted, voice trembling. "But I saw it that night, in you. I just didn't know how to hold it without breaking it." Elena listened, her face unreadable, arms folded protectively over her chest. And then she told her story. Not just the moments he missed, but the nights she cried silently into a pillow while babies kicked inside her. The panic of not affording enough diapers, the terror of getting sick and not knowing who would care for her children, the sheer exhaustion of doing it all alone. She confessed the moments she hated him, and the moments she still loved him, both of which had hurt equally. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and Elliot didn't dare interrupt. He sat there, absorbing each word like a man drowning in his own regret. When she finished, there was a long pause between them, the kind of pause that only exists between two souls balancing on the edge of ruin and redemption. Elliot slowly got off the couch and dropped to his knees before her, not as a man making grand gestures, but as someone offering his heart, shattered and sincere. His hands shook as he reached for hers, but he didn't touch them until she let him. And when her fingers relaxed just slightly, his voice cracked as he whispered, "Elena, I don't have a ring. I don't have poetry. I only have this. I don't want to miss another heartbeat of your life, or theirs. I want every sleepless night, every milestone, every laugh, every tear. I want to be there when they fall and when they rise. I want to be the man who earns your love every day, not just once." Her chest rose with a tremble. For a moment she closed her eyes and tilted her head back, allowing his words to settle like a slow rain over a long drought. When she opened them, her gaze met his, and for the first time, there was no wall between them. "You left me in pieces," she said softly. "I had to build myself without you." "I know," he whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that way again." Silence held them. Then, slowly, she leaned forward. Not quite a kiss, not quite an embrace, but a closeness that hinted at forgiveness without fully giving it. "This doesn't mean I trust you," she murmured. "It means I'm letting you try." And for Elliot, that was more than he had dared to hope for. From that day forward, he began showing up differently, not just at her apartment, but in every layer of her life. He took paternity leave from his company, a move that shocked the entire business world. Billionaire CEO Elliot Lancaster, stepping down for personal reasons, was the headline that stunned the media. But he didn't care. He was too busy helping bathe the babies, cleaning bottles, soothing colicky cries at 3 in the morning, and learning how to swaddle without making a mess of it. He cooked breakfast, picked up groceries, and even attended mommy and me classes where he was often the only father. He became part of the everyday, not as a guest, but as a partner. He moved into the spare room, not Elena's bed, not yet. That space remained sacred, untouched until she was ready. And Elliot respected that. He didn't rush her. Instead, he made her coffee just the way she liked it. He memorized the lullabies she hummed under her breath and sang them to the babies when she was too tired. He wrote her notes on the fridge. He took pictures of their children and framed them on the wall, calling the little apartment our house of healing. And gradually her laughter returned. It was faint at first, like an echo from a happier time, but then it became real, louder, brighter, full of color. One evening, while feeding the babies side by side, Elena leaned her head on his shoulder without saying a word. Elliot froze, not out of surprise, but reverence, because that moment, that simple, quiet lean, was more valuable to him than any diamond or billion-dollar deal. It was the slow opening of a heart that had once been sealed. And in that house of healing, they weren't just repairing a broken love. They were creating a new one, built not on grand promises, but on daily acts of care, trust, and unspoken grace. The evening light slanted across the soft wooden floor as Elena stood before the mirror, not in her usual lounge dress, not with exhaustion lining her eyes from night feedings, but wrapped in a gown so breathtakingly elegant that it seemed stitched from the clouds themselves. The silk clung to her curves like it was made for her soul, the off-shoulder sleeves revealing the soft strength of her collarbones, and the flowing train of her wedding dress whispered across the floor like a quiet promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. Her long, stylish hair was pinned with tiny pearls, not overdone, just enough to crown her in the grace she always carried, but rarely claimed. Her smooth brown skin glowed with warmth, kissed by soft makeup that highlighted her wide, kind eyes, eyes that had once brimmed with pain, but now shimmered with cautious joy. The mirror caught a woman reborn, not because of a man, but because of the battles she'd fought, the love she'd never given up on, and the strength she'd earned inch by inch. Behind her, soft baby coos sounded. Her mother gently lifted the babies, 2 boys and a girl, each in tiny ivory outfits stitched with gold thread, matching bow ties for the boys and a flower headband for the little girl. Elena took them into her arms one at a time, pressing gentle kisses on their cheeks. She whispered softly, "Your mama's finally getting her fairy tale, not because she needed saving, but because she saved herself first." Outside, the garden had transformed into a dream. Twinkling lights floated overhead like stars had come to witness her joy. The pathway was lined with white rose petals, leading to a small altar draped in sheer ivory cloth and golden vines. There weren't hundreds of guests, only the ones who mattered. People who had walked beside Elena in her hardest days, her former nurse from the maternity ward, her boss who had watched her juggle bottles and client files with equal determination, a few neighbors who had helped carry groceries or watched the babies while she took a power nap, and at the front, in a perfectly tailored suit the color of deep midnight, stood Elliot, not the cold CEO she had once met at a gala, not the man who had walked away from her without a backward glance, but the man who had learned to kneel beside a crib at 2 a.m., who had memorized how she took her tea, who had knelt for love and stayed kneeling ever since. His hands trembled slightly as he watched her walk forward, holding their children with grace that belonged on the pages of timeless poetry. The air didn't buzz with drama. It hummed with reverence. When she reached the altar, Elliot stepped forward and gently, reverently, took the babies from her arms, kissing each of their cheeks with a father's pride before handing them off to family members in the front row. And then he turned back to Elena, as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The officiant's voice faded into the background as their eyes locked, a silent world of memories exchanged in one shared gaze. When it was time to speak, Elliot didn't read from paper. His hands trembled, but his voice didn't waver. I once thought love was weakness, that needing someone made you vulnerable, but then I met you, and I realized love is the greatest strength a man can have, especially when it's with someone like you. You taught me what it means to fight, not with grand gestures, but with sleepless nights, unwavering love, and unshakable dignity. Today, I don't just marry the mother of my children. I marry the woman who taught me how to be a man. I promise you loyalty, gentleness, patience, and fire that never fades. The tears came uninvited to Elena's cheeks, but she let them fall without shame. When it was her turn, she didn't reach for her written words either. Her voice was quiet but firm. I never wanted a man who made promises in poetry but disappeared when things got hard. I wanted someone who stayed, and you left, but you came back with your heart open. That matters more to me than perfection ever could. I don't need a knight. I need a partner. And today I marry a man who became that, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. I promise you trust, forgiveness, and love that will rise with you and carry you when you fall. Their hands joined, and with rings placed, a simple gold band for each. No diamonds, just meaning. They sealed a bond that had once shattered, but now gleamed even stronger in its imperfection. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Elliot didn't dive into a dramatic kiss. He leaned forward slowly, cupping her jaw with both hands as if she were made of something holy, and placed the softest, most reverent kiss on her lips, a kiss that said, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. Not ever again." The applause around them faded into a blur as the newlyweds turned, hand in hand, back down the aisle, their babies reunited in their arms, forming the kind of picture that didn't need filters or perfection, just love. That night, in the sanctuary of their new home, a modest but warm villa Elliot had renovated with her favorite flowers in the garden and a nursery fit for three, they put the babies to sleep together. Elliot carried the final baby to the crib, with his shirt slightly wrinkled, his tie forgotten on the couch, his heart full. Elena watched him from the bedroom doorway, her wedding dress exchanged for a simple silk robe. When he turned and saw her, something shifted in the room. The silence grew thick with emotion, not just desire, but depth, years of ache finally finding a home. She stepped closer, and he didn't touch her immediately. He waited, letting her decide, letting her lead. She moved first, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palms. "Are you nervous?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "Terrified," he said. Not of you, of failing again. She smiled, not with mockery, but with grace. Then don't. Just be here. That's all I've ever wanted. And with that, they kissed, this time deeper, more urgent, the kind of kiss that poured years of longing into one breath. They fell onto the bed, not with fire alone, but with the rhythm of rediscovery. His hands traced every curve like it was scripture, her skin the canvas where forgiveness was painted with every touch. Their wedding night wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, it was sacred. Between soft sheets and hushed laughter, between whispered I love yous and the silence that didn't need words, they found each other again. Not just as lovers, but as soulmates who had walked through fire and chosen to return. When they lay tangled in each other's arms beneath the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, Elliot turned and kissed her temple. "This is the life I didn't know I was waiting for," he murmured. Elena nestled closer, her fingers tracing small circles over his chest. "And this is the man I didn't believe could exist." He tilted her chin, kissed her slowly, and with the weight of years slipping away, they fell asleep as husband and wife, as partners, as parents, as the two people who finally had their forever. Earned, scarred, and infinitely real. The morning sunlight poured into the softly curtained bedroom like a gentle whisper of grace, illuminating the silhouettes of a family wrapped in a delicate, sleepy embrace. The last remnants of a love-filled night still hanging in the air as Elena stirred gently, her fingers grazing Elliot's chest while the steady rhythm of his breath warmed the space between them, her head resting in the crook of his arm where she now felt safest, no longer haunted by memories of silence or absence, but healed in the sanctuary of togetherness that had been carved not through ease, but through storms they survived hand in hand, and just as her eyes fluttered open to meet the morning's glow, her heart pulsed with a quiet, breathtaking realization that she was living inside a moment she once thought was impossible, a life built not on empty promises, but on the hard-earned truth of a man who had transformed from a ghost in the dark to the lighthouse guiding them all through nights of uncertainty. Elliot Lancaster, once the cold CEO who shattered her with distance and neglect, now lay beside her with the softness of a man reborn through love, his bare chest rising and falling beneath her hand, his face relaxed in a way she rarely saw during their past, and as if sensing her gaze, he blinked awake and immediately smiled, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, a morning ritual he never missed, whispering softly, "Good morning, my forever." And in those few words, Elena found a kind of warmth no silk could offer, no riches could replace, only love in its purest, rawest, realest form, and before the quiet could deepen, tiny squeals erupted from the adjacent nursery, followed by soft thumps of little hands knocking on the crib bars, and Elliot was already on his feet, with that playful grin he reserved only for their children, pulling on pajama pants as he rushed to the next room, Elena trailing behind him, barefoot and glowing in her oversized robe. The picture of a mother no longer burdened but bathed in joy as Elliot reached into the first crib and scooped up one of their sons, who giggled instantly, tugging at his father's tousled morning hair, while the second boy made babbling sounds that resembled Dada, and the tiny girl in the last crib blinked up at her parents with wide, innocent eyes that looked so much like Elena's, soft brown and soulful, and as Elliot handed her over with reverence, pressing a kiss to her miniature forehead, Elena cradled the little girl and smiled so wide it seemed the years of heartbreak finally surrendered, leaving only peace. Soon the kitchen filled with the aroma of sizzling butter and warm syrup, as Elliot stood by the stove, flipping golden pancakes, one baby strapped to his chest in a soft carrier, another in a bouncer nearby, and their daughter wrapped in Elena's arms as she swayed gently to a song playing on the speaker, something soft and jazzy that made their morning feel like a scene out of a romantic film. And as they laughed over shared bites of food and sticky fingers, Elliot would sometimes pause, gaze at Eleanor from across the table and say, "You gave me a life I never knew I needed," to which she'd reply with a wink, "And you finally showed up for the life that was waiting." Their words no longer sharp like old wounds, but smooth like river stones, polished by time and love. And when the babies went down for a nap, the living room would transform into a dance floor of domestic bliss. Elliot taking her hand and twirling her in the soft afternoon light, her laughter echoing against the walls that once held her silence. And in those simple, beautiful dances, their love story breathed, not as a performance for anyone else, but as a thank you to the universe for bringing them to this chapter, where forgiveness lived louder than pride and passion, no longer had an expiration date, but pulsed anew with every breath, every glance, every brush of fingertips. At night, after bottles were rinsed and lullabies were sung, they curled up together on the couch, Eleanor's head on Elliot's shoulder as he stroked her arm gently, often reading aloud stories or whispering plans for the future, like the cabin retreat they'd take next spring, or the tiny tattoos of their children's initials they'd get one day, little dreams layered on top of big ones. And when they finally climbed into bed, it wasn't just about passion, though the fire still flickered bright between them. It was about presence, about being seen and held and treasured. And as Elena traced slow, lazy lines across his skin, and he wrapped his arms tightly around her, they would talk about how far they'd come, how the woman who was once left behind became the queen of a castle built on second chances, how the man who once feared love now worshipped it with every act of devotion, how their babies cooed in dreams under a roof filled with laughter and safety, and how fate may have written a tragic beginning, but they, together, rewrote the ending. One soft kiss at a time, one sleepless night survived with love, one promise kept even when it was hard. And as they drifted to sleep in the cradle of everything they had fought to build, Elena nestled closer and whispered the words she once thought she'd never say again. Not with trust, not with her whole heart. "I'm home." And Elliot, already half asleep, pulled her tighter, replying in a groggy voice that still made her smile, "You've always been mine, and now I'm finally yours too, forever." And with that, the final chapter of their pain quietly folded itself into a book now closed, resting on the shelf of memory as a new story began. Not one of heartbreak, but of healing, a story not told in grand declarations or glittering affairs, but in pancakes made from scratch, in midnight diaper changes shared equally, in kisses stolen while rocking a baby, in mornings that began with soft laughter and ended in arms wrapped tightly around each other, in a life that didn't need perfect timing. Just two imperfect souls who found their way back and now lived in the paradise they created together, full of love, full of grace, full of everything they once lost but now held with both hands, never to let go again.